"I'll make you lose your mind," the Apache widow said to the lonely rancher who would change her life. The plain stretched endlessly under the pale morning sky, a sea of dry grass that shimmered like gold in the first light. The rancher rode slowly along the dusty path, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. He had lived on this land for years, yet the loneliness of the frontier never left him. He was used to silence, to the empty wind whispering through the tall grass, to the way the nights could be so quiet it felt like the world had forgotten him. Most people in the nearby town thought him strange. They called him the lonely rancher, the quiet man who never sought company. He paid them no mind. Company, he thought, could bring as much trouble as it could comfort, and he had learned to live with the solitude. The rancher had grown careful over the years. He worked early in the morning, tending to his cattle and mending fences, always alert for wild animals or wandering bandits. He knew the land well, every hill and stream, every hollow and rise. Still, he could not know what the day would bring. On this morning, he was drawn toward a part of the plains he usually avoided. There was a small cabin near the edge of the woods, and rumors had reached him that a woman lived there. Not just any woman. An Apache widow who had lost her husband in a raid long ago. People in the town whispered about her. They said she was fierce and proud, someone not to be trifled with. They warned the rancher to stay away. But something in him could not resist curiosity. He had lived too long in isolation, and the thought of someone living alone, like him, sparked a strange interest. He approached the cabin slowly, his horse careful on the uneven ground. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he could see the faint outline of a woman moving inside. She was smaller than he imagined, yet her presence seemed to fill the space. When she noticed him at the edge of the clearing, she stepped out. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and her eyes were sharp, almost daring him to come closer. "I'll make you lose your mind," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying over the wind. The rancher blinked. He had not expected words like that. He had faced storms, wild animals, even thieves, but never had someone spoken to him like this. He dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her. "I mean no harm," he said, keeping his voice calm. He did not know if she would believe him, but he had to try. She watched him for a moment, then nodded slightly, though her expression remained unreadable. "Then stay out of trouble," she said, stepping aside to let him approach. The rancher noticed the cabin was small but well kept. Firewood was stacked neatly, and a few pots hung above the stove. Despite its modest size, the place felt strong, like the woman herself. He could see why people said she was proud. She had built this life with her own hands, surviving in a land that demanded courage. Over the next few days, the rancher found reasons to return. Sometimes he helped her repair a broken fence. Other times he delivered supplies from town she could not fetch herself. Each visit was a careful dance. She teased him, testing his patience, making him doubt himself, and yet he found himself drawn back again and again. He could not explain why. Her words, sharp and sometimes mocking, stirred something inside him, something he had not felt in years. He was used to silence, to solitude, and now there was this woman who challenged him at every turn. The rancher began to notice small things about her. How she moved quietly in the cabin, how her hands were strong from years of work, how her eyes softened when she thought no one was watching. There was sorrow in her, a weight he could feel even without knowing her story. He guessed she had suffered much, that the loss of her husband had left a scar no one could see but him. And yet, she carried herself with a pride and strength that amazed him. She did not ask for help easily, did not give her trust quickly, and that made every small sign of kindness she allowed feel like a treasure. One afternoon, the rancher found her gathering herbs near the stream. The sun was high, and the wind moved the tall grass like waves in the ocean. He dismounted and walked toward her, careful to keep his movements calm. She glanced up and raised an eyebrow, waiting to see if he would speak. "Do you always work alone?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She laughed softly, a sound that surprised him. "Always," she said. "It keeps me alive." Her eyes were serious again, but he could see a flicker of humor there. "But maybe," she added after a pause, "someone like you might enjoy being driven a little crazy." He frowned, unsure whether to take it as a challenge or a warning. "I would be so happy. I do not scare easily," he said, trying to meet her gaze without faltering. Her smile widened. "We shall see," she said, turning back to her work, as if the conversation were already over. But the rancher felt something shift inside him. He realized that life on the frontier had been predictable, safe in its solitude, but now, for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of uncertainty and curiosity. Days turned into weeks. The rancher found himself thinking of her at night, wondering how she spent her days when he was not there, imagining her laughter, her sharp words, the way she moved through her cabin with purpose. He noticed how she began to expect him, how she sometimes left small tasks unfinished, perhaps knowing he would help. He could see her trust growing slowly, cautiously, like a seed pushing through the soil toward sunlight. One evening, after a long day of repairing fences and tending cattle, the rancher rode to her cabin as usual. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and wildflowers. She was sitting outside, sharpening a knife, her eyes watching the horizon. She looked up as he approached and said nothing. Instead, she motioned for him to sit beside her. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the sounds of the plains. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and almost hesitant. "I have lived alone for many years," she said. "I do not know how to let someone in." The rancher nodded, understanding. "I have known loneliness too," he said quietly. "I know what it is to watch the world go by and feel no one notices you." Her eyes softened, but only slightly. "Then perhaps you understand why I say I will make you lose your mind," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It is not cruelty, it is caution. I have survived by being careful. To let someone in is to risk everything." He looked at her and felt a strange warmth, a connection he had not expected. "I will take the risk," he said. "I do not wish to be lost in solitude any longer." The woman studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "Then we shall see," she said. Her voice held a challenge, a promise, and perhaps even a hint of hope. The rancher realized that this was only the beginning. The plains stretched endlessly around them, but now there was a presence beside him that made the emptiness feel smaller, the dangers feel shared, and the future feel uncertain in a way that was exciting rather than frightening. That night, as he rode back to his cabin, the rancher could not stop thinking of her. He remembered her words, the fierce warning that had drawn him in, "I'll make you lose your mind." He did not know what she meant entirely, but he felt a thrill he had not felt in years. The frontier had always been harsh, lonely, and unforgiving, but now there was a new element, unpredictable, alive, and human. He understood that meeting her had changed something inside him, something he could not ignore. In the days that followed, he continued to visit. Sometimes they worked together on chores. Sometimes they simply shared the quiet of the plains, speaking in short sentences, sharing small details of their lives. He learned about her past, the hardships she had endured, the love she had lost, and the strength she had gained. She learned about him, his struggles, his dreams, and the ways he had learned to survive in solitude. Every meeting, every conversation seemed to pull them closer, even as she maintained her fierce independence. The rancher began to realize that life on the frontier was not just about survival. It was about connection, about the courage to let someone in, about the willingness to face the unknown together. He did not know how this relationship would unfold, or whether it would lead to joy or heartache, but he knew one thing for certain: he could not turn away. The woman's words echoed in his mind, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a challenge. "I'll make you lose your mind." And he knew deep down that he welcomed the chaos, the change, and the chance to experience life in a way he had never dared before. The plains were still vast, quiet, and demanding, but now, for the first time in years, the rancher did not feel alone. Somewhere on the edge of the woods, the widow waited, fierce and proud, and slowly, inexorably, their lives were beginning to intertwine in ways neither could yet fully understand. The days grew warmer as spring slowly crept across the plains. The rancher's routine had changed. He no longer rose merely to tend cattle or repair fences. He rose with a quiet anticipation, wondering what the day would bring at the edge of the woods. Each morning he would ride toward the widow's cabin, and each day he found new ways to earn her cautious approval. Sometimes it was fixing a roof tile that had loosened in a late winter storm. Sometimes it was helping her gather firewood or water from the distant stream. The work was simple, yet every small act carried weight. It was his way of showing that he was steady, reliable, and willing to face the unpredictability of her world alongside her. The widow watched him closely, her sharp eyes noting his movements, his gestures, the small details that revealed his character. She had survived long enough to recognize the difference between someone who offered help out of curiosity and someone who offered it out of care. At first she had tested him with small challenges, asking him to climb the highest hill to check the fence posts, to mend a broken tool, or to carry water in the blazing sun. He met each task with quiet determination, never complaining, never showing impatience. The widow found herself impressed, though she refused to admit it aloud. Pride kept her wary, even as her curiosity about this man grew. One afternoon she invited him inside her cabin. The interior was small but warm, filled with handcrafted tools, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and a few well-worn blankets. She had cleared a space near the stove, and the smell of cooking meat and bread filled the room. "Sit," she said, pointing to a wooden stool. Her voice was firm but not unkind. The rancher obeyed, careful to keep his hat in his lap and his back straight. He noticed the faint scar on her cheek, a reminder of the raid that had taken her husband and nearly destroyed her. He wondered about the pain she must carry, hidden beneath her strength and sharp words. "I thought you might want a break," he said quietly. "The day is hot, and you have worked hard." She studied him, then allowed a small smile to touch her lips. "You are persistent," she said. "Most men would have left long ago." Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of truth. "Persistence can be a blessing or a curse," she added. "I hope yours is the first." They spoke little after that, letting the warmth of the fire fill the room and the smell of food make the silence comfortable. The rancher noticed how her presence affected him. Her quiet confidence, her strength, her small gestures of kindness, they drew him in, but she was still a puzzle he could not fully solve. He wanted to know her, to understand her world, but he respected the boundaries she had set. She, in turn, began to observe his character beyond the surface. She saw the quiet determination, the patience, and the careful respect he showed her land and life. Slowly, walls that had guarded her heart for so many years began to tremble. Days passed, and their interactions became routine but never dull. They shared meals, stories of past hardships, and small jokes that lightened the long afternoons. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains with golden light, the rancher found her sitting on a log outside, watching the horizon. He approached slowly, not wanting to disturb her. "You are quiet today," she said, her eyes still fixed on the distant hills. "Quiet is comfortable sometimes," he replied. "It gives time to think." She turned to look at him, and he saw the hint of vulnerability she usually kept hidden. "I have thought a lot lately," she admitted. "About my husband, about the life I have built alone, and about this world that seems both empty and full of dangers." She paused, searching his eyes. "You are not like other men. You do not scare me, and yet I wonder what you think when you see me like this." The rancher knelt beside her, choosing his words carefully. "I think about what you have survived. I think about the strength it takes to face each day alone. And I think, I want to be here. I want to be someone you can trust, even if it takes time to earn it." Her eyes softened further, and for a moment the sharpness in her gaze faded. She nodded slowly, then returned her attention to the horizon. "Trust is a fragile thing," she said quietly. "I have learned not to give it freely." "I understand," he said. "I do not ask for it yet. I only offer myself, in whatever way you allow." The weeks continued, and with each passing day they discovered new dimensions of each other. The rancher learned to navigate her world, the way she managed her small garden, the careful storage of food for the winter, the routines that had kept her safe for so many years. He began to understand the depth of her independence, her unwillingness to rely on anyone, and the courage it took to survive in a land that offered little mercy. She, in turn, learned about his life, his solitude, and the quiet resolve that had shaped him into the man he was. She saw how he treated the land, the animals, and even strangers passing through the town. He was honest, patient, and steady, a man who did not demand, who did not rush, who allowed her to maintain control while offering support. It was a delicate balance, but it was the start of something neither had expected. One evening, a distant storm approached, the wind carrying the scent of rain and the sound of thunder rolling across the plains. The widow's cabin, sturdy as it was, would need preparation. The rancher arrived just as the first drops began to fall. Together, they secured the roof, tied down supplies, and guided the few livestock she kept close to shelter. They worked side by side, the storm pressing against them, testing their endurance and patience. When the last of the animals were safe and the cabin secured, they stood together, soaked and exhausted, watching the rain fall in sheets. "We make a good team," the rancher said, his voice low. The widow's lips curved in a small smile, but her eyes were serious. "Perhaps," she said. "But storms are not just outside. Sometimes the heart has its own storms." He looked at her, understanding the meaning behind her words. Life had not been kind to her. Love, trust, and loss were all storms she had weathered. And now in her presence he felt the beginnings of a new storm, one that threatened to change both their lives in ways they could not predict. As the storm passed and the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, they returned inside. The fire had been rekindled, and the warmth spread through the small cabin. They shared a simple meal in silence, the kind of silence that was comfortable and full of unspoken understanding. The widow looked at him, and for the first time he thought he saw something tender in her gaze, something that suggested she was beginning to consider the possibility of another kind of life, one where trust and companionship were not just words, but lived experiences. Over the next few days, their relationship deepened. The rancher found himself seeking her company, not out of duty or curiosity, but because he genuinely enjoyed her presence. She challenged him, teased him, and sometimes tested his patience, yet he found himself responding with care, understanding, and even humor. Their conversations became longer, more personal, touching on hopes, fears, and memories that were usually kept hidden. The widow, too, found herself drawn to him in ways she had not expected. His quiet strength, his patience, and his willingness to meet her on her terms unsettled her, yet it was a welcome disruption. She had lived so long relying only on herself that the thought of depending on someone else seemed dangerous, but also exciting. He did not demand her trust. He earned it slowly, quietly, and with respect. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant hues of red and gold, they sat outside the cabin, watching the plains stretch endlessly before them. The wind carried the faint scent of wildflowers and wet earth from the recent rain. The rancher broke the silence. "I have never met anyone like you," he said. "You are strong, brave, and wise. You have survived more than I could imagine, and yet here you are, still standing." The widow's gaze softened, and she allowed herself a small smile. "And I have never met anyone like you," she admitted. "You are quiet, patient, and steadfast. You do not demand my trust, yet you offer yourself anyway. It is—" He reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing his hand near hers. She did not pull away, though she did not move closer either. "Perhaps," he said softly, "we are both learning something new. About life, about trust, and about what it means to face the world together." She looked at him, and for the first time she did not speak a warning. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the frontier, harsh as it was, could also hold new beginnings. The plains stretched endlessly before them, a land of challenges, hardships, and beauty. And in the midst of it all, two people, each shaped by loss and resilience, were discovering the fragile, powerful force of trust and companionship. The rancher knew the road ahead would not be easy. Life on the frontier was full of dangers, and the widow's past had left scars that would not disappear overnight. Yet, he also knew that they were stronger together than apart. Each day, each shared task, each small conversation built a foundation of understanding, respect, and care. And slowly, the walls they had each built around their hearts began to crumble, revealing the possibility of something neither had expected, but both secretly desired. As night fell, they sat side by side outside the cabin, watching the stars appear one by one. The widow spoke softly, almost to herself. "Perhaps we are not so alone after all." The rancher glanced at her, his heart stirring with hope and quiet determination. "Not alone," he agreed. And in that moment, under the wide, endless sky, a bond began to form. Strong, tentative, and real. One that would shape the days, weeks, and years to come. Spring had settled firmly over the plains, and the land had begun to awaken. The grass was greener, the streams fuller, and the days longer. For the rancher and the widow, life had begun to feel slightly less lonely, yet the frontier had its own way of reminding them that comfort could be fragile. Each morning they woke to the sounds of birds and the rustle of the wind, and each day brought new chores, new challenges, and the constant reminder that their bond, however promising, could be tested at any moment. The rancher had grown accustomed to the widow's ways. He knew the careful steps she took when walking near the edge of the woods, the way she inspected her livestock, and the precise order in which she managed her supplies. He admired her skill and her independence, and he worked quietly alongside her, never rushing, never demanding. Yet he also noticed how the faintest threat, an approaching stranger, a sudden sound in the night, would sharpen her senses, reminding him that life in her world was never simple. One afternoon a rider appeared in the distance, kicking up dust as he approached the cabin. The widow's hand went to the knife at her belt instinctively, while the rancher dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. The man was from the town, a merchant carrying supplies and news. He had no ill intent, yet his arrival stirred unease. The widow welcomed him carefully, asking him to leave his horse a short distance from the cabin. She listened as he spoke, cautious but polite, and she nodded to the rancher when the man departed, signaling that the immediate tension had passed. "Life is never quiet," she said quietly after the rider left. Her voice held no anger, only the truth of her experience. Even when you think you are safe, the world reminds you that danger is always near. "I have noticed, but perhaps it is not only danger we face. It is also the fear of losing what we begin to care about." Her eyes softened, though only slightly. "Perhaps," she said, "but caring is dangerous. I have learned to survive without relying on anyone. To let someone in is to risk everything." The rancher moved closer. "I know the risk. And yet I still choose to stay." The widow studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching for sincerity. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Then we shall see if your words are more than just talk." As the days passed, the rancher's presence became part of the widow's routine. They worked together to repair fences damaged by the spring storms, tended to the few cattle she owned, and gathered food from the land. Every shared task deepened their understanding of each other. The rancher learned how careful she was with her supplies, how she rationed food to ensure survival through any shortage, and how she moved silently and efficiently through her small domain. He began to understand the discipline it took for her to live alone and the courage required to face every day without relying on anyone else. For her part, the widow observed his steadfastness. She saw the way he treated her land with respect, never overstepping boundaries or making assumptions. He did not demand attention or affection, and yet he offered himself consistently, patiently, and without expectation. It was a quiet strength that unsettled her, yet she found herself drawn to it. She had spent years testing people and keeping her distance, and now, slowly, she began to consider the possibility of companionship. One evening, the rancher helped her repair a section of fence near the woods. The sun was low, painting the plains in gold and amber, and the wind carried the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. They worked side by side, silent except for the occasional comment about the fence or the weather. When the last post was secured, they stood together, surveying the land. "You have a good eye," the widow said. "The fence will hold through the storms now." "And so will you," the rancher replied quietly, not meaning just the fence. Her eyes flicked to him, sharp and searching. "Do not speak carelessly," she said. "Words can be as dangerous as any threat outside these walls." "I am careful," he said, meeting her gaze. "I choose my words with purpose. I do not wish to harm." For a moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, a subtle acknowledgement that trust was growing, even if neither fully admitted it. Yet the frontier would not allow them long to bask in the small victories of companionship. A few days later, the widow's cabin was threatened by fire. A lightning strike had ignited a small patch of dry grass near the woods, and the wind was strong enough to carry the flames toward her home. The rancher arrived just as the fire began to spread, and together they fought it with buckets of water, wet blankets, and quick thinking. The fire crackled, smoke stung their eyes, and the heat pressed against them, yet they did not falter. They moved with coordination, each anticipating the other's actions, relying on instinct and experience to protect the cabin and the animals. When the last ember was extinguished, they stood together, exhausted and covered in soot, but alive. The widow looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and something she could not yet name. "You could have left," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I could have," he admitted, "but I did not. I stay because I choose to, because I care." For the first time, her sharp exterior softened completely. She looked away, focusing on the blackened grass and the faint smoke rising in the distance. "Caring is dangerous," she whispered. "And yet I am glad you stayed." The rancher stepped closer, careful not to press too far. "We face dangers together," he said. "It is better than facing them alone." In the days that followed, their bond grew stronger. They shared stories of past hardships, recalling memories of loss, survival, and the quiet victories of everyday life. The widow spoke of her late husband, of the raid that had taken him, and of the years she had spent rebuilding her life alone. The rancher listened, offering words of understanding, never judgment, never pity. He shared his own stories of solitude, of the empty nights spent watching over cattle, and of the longing for connection that had never been fulfilled. Through these exchanges, they began to understand each other's pain, resilience, and humanity. They learned that trust was not given lightly, and that patience, respect, and consistency were the paths to earning it. The rancher admired her strength and independence, and she admired his quiet determination and gentle presence. Yet, as their bond deepened, so too did the tension. The widow had lived long enough to know that life on the frontier was unpredictable. A single wrong step could bring disaster. She worried that allowing someone into her life, even this man, could endanger the fragile stability she had created. The rancher, too, felt the weight of her caution. He knew that to love her was to accept the risks, the fears, and the unknown challenges that came with her past and the harshness of the land. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of pink and purple, the widow and rancher sat outside the cabin sharing a quiet meal. The wind moved the tall grass like waves, and the distant hills were darkening in shadow. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You have stayed," she said softly, "through storms, fire, and the silence of my world. Why?" He took a deep breath. "Because I choose to, because I see your strength, your heart, and a life you have built. I do not fear the challenges. I want to face them with you." Her eyes searched his, sharp and unwavering. "I have lived alone for so long. I am used to solitude. To let someone in, it is not easy. I know," he said gently, "and I will not rush. I will stay, as I have, and earn the trust you give." For a long moment silence passed between them, filled only by the sounds of the plains and the distant call of a hawk. Finally, the widow nodded, a subtle acceptance that perhaps companionship was possible, even after years of caution and loss. As night fell, they sat side by side, watching the stars appear one by one. The rancher felt a quiet hope growing in his chest, a belief that trust, patience, and shared courage could build something lasting, even in a world as harsh and unpredictable as the frontier. The widow, too, felt a shift, a recognition that she was beginning to rely on someone else, and that it was not a weakness but a strength. The frontier had tested them, challenged them, and reminded them of the dangers of caring. Yet in facing these trials together, they found a new understanding, a bond forged not only through necessity but through choice, respect, and the shared experience of survival. The rancher knew that challenges would continue. Life on the plains was never simple, and the past and present could collide at any moment. But he also knew that together they could face the storms, the fires, and the uncertainties ahead. And the widow, who had vowed to remain alone, began to understand that trust and companionship could be gifts worth risking everything for. In the quiet of the night, beneath the wide, endless sky, the two of them sat together, their lives intertwined in ways they were only beginning to understand. They had faced danger, weathered trials, and shared moments of laughter and quiet reflection. And though the path ahead was uncertain, both knew that the bond forming between them was strong, fragile, and real, a bond that would carry them forward into the challenges and joys of the frontier. The summer sun hung high in the sky, relentless and hot, beating down on the plains and drying the earth until it cracked beneath their boots. Life on the ranch had grown into a rhythm, but comfort was always fragile. The rancher and the widow had grown closer, their trust deepening with every shared task and quiet conversation. Yet even as they laughed together and worked side by side, the frontier reminded them that danger could strike when least expected. It began with a small warning. One morning, as the rancher checked the fences along the edge of the property, he noticed unusual tracks in the dust. They were not from deer or cattle, nor from the occasional fox or coyote. These tracks were deliberate, measured, and heavy. He studied them carefully, tracing the patterns back toward the woods. He returned to the cabin with a heavy heart, warning the widow to remain vigilant. She listened, her sharp eyes narrowing as she examined the ground herself. "They are close," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Strangers, people who do not belong here." She did not fear them entirely, but her instincts told her to prepare for trouble. "We must be ready," she added, turning to him. "I will not let them take what we have built." Together, they reinforced the cabin and secured the livestock. The widow had always been self-reliant, but she allowed the rancher to take part in the preparations. He learned how to strengthen the doors, tie the animals in safe areas, and keep watch without drawing unnecessary attention. They worked in silence for most of the day, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. Each knew that the trust and bond they had built over the past months would be tested by what was coming. That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the plains in shades of red and gold. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke from a distant fire, though they could not see it. They shared a simple meal, but the silence was heavier than usual. The rancher looked at the widow, noticing the faint lines of worry etched on her face. "We have faced storms and fire before," he said quietly. "We can face this too." She nodded, her lips pressed in a thin line. "Perhaps," she said, "but this is different. These are people who seek more than survival. They want to take, and I will not let them. As darkness fell, the first signs of danger appeared. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the faint sound of voices carried across the plain. The rancher moved to the edge of the cabin, scanning the shadows. The widow followed silently, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. Both were alert, their senses sharpened by months of living on the frontier. The intruders were a small group, armed and desperate, looking for food, supplies, and anything they could take. The rancher and the widow waited, hidden behind the cabin in the low ridge of the land, watching for the right moment. The widow's experience told her that confrontation was inevitable, but strategy would determine who survived. The first man approached the cabin cautiously, unaware that he was being watched. The widow signaled to the rancher, and together they moved quietly to intercept. A tense moment passed, then the rancher stepped forward, calling out in a firm voice, "This land is not yours. Leave now, and no one will be hurt." The men hesitated, sizing up the situation. They were desperate and bold, but neither expected resistance from the widow, who now stepped into view. Her posture was strong, unyielding, and full of authority. "You will not take what is mine," she said, her voice carrying over the plain. "Leave or face the consequences." One of the men laughed, raising his weapon. "And who will stop us? You, alone?" The widow's eyes met the rancher's, and he nodded. They moved together, a single force of courage and resolve. The confrontation was brief but fierce. Using a combination of strategy, speed, and knowledge of the land, they managed to drive the intruders away. The men fled, muttering threats and stumbling over the uneven ground. The rancher and the widow remained standing, breathing heavily, hearts pounding from the adrenaline. When the danger passed, the widow turned to him, her eyes wide with both relief and something more difficult to name. "You stayed," she said, almost in disbelief. "You did not leave, even when it was dangerous." "I stayed because I promised," he replied, "and because I care. You and this land matter to me." For a moment, she said nothing, simply studying him. Her hand rested on the hilt of her knife, but the tension in her body began to ease. "Caring is dangerous," she whispered. "And yet, I am glad you stayed." The night passed slowly, with both of them sitting outside, keeping watch. They spoke little, letting the silence speak for them. The rancher knew that the frontier had tested many before them, and he understood that this challenge was not just about survival. It was about trust, courage, and the willingness to stand together when danger arrived. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to a fragile peace. The tracks in the dust were gone, the intruders had disappeared, and the cabin and livestock were safe. Yet the event had left its mark. Both the widow and the rancher had seen what they were willing to risk for each other. They had faced fear together, and it had brought them closer in ways words could not express. The widow began to allow herself small gestures of trust. She shared stories of her late husband, of the moment she had survived on her own, and of the fears that had kept her distant for so many years. The rancher listened, never interrupting, never judging. He shared his own past, his experiences of solitude, and his quiet hope that life could be richer when shared. One evening, as the sun set in deep orange and purple, the widow invited the rancher to help her with a new project. She wanted to expand her garden, creating a small area to grow more food for the coming months. They worked side by side, planting seeds, digging furrows, and laughing when the sun burned their backs. It was simple work, yet it held profound meaning. It symbolized a willingness to build something together, to nurture life, and to invest in a future that neither had dared to imagine alone. As they rested, sitting on a log and catching their breath, the widow looked at the rancher. "I did not expect to allow someone into my life again," she admitted. "I have lived too long alone, trusting only myself. And yet," he said softly, "here we are, together. Not because it is easy, but because it matters." Her gaze softened, and for the first time in months, the harsh lines of caution in her face relaxed. She reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "Perhaps there is more to life than survival," she whispered. The rancher smiled, feeling a warmth he had not known in years. "There is," he said, "and we can face it together." But the frontier was never forgiving. The challenges of the land, the past, and the people who lived nearby ensured that peace was always temporary. The rancher knew that they would face more storms, more threats, and more trials, yet he also knew that facing them together, as partners, was different from facing them alone. The widow, too, felt the weight of this truth. She had tested him, and he had stayed. She had guarded her heart, and he had earned her trust. One late evening, after tending to the last of the livestock, they sat outside the cabin, watching the stars appear, one by one. The wind moved the grass in gentle waves, and the plains stretched endlessly before them. The widow spoke softly, almost to herself. I have always believed that solitude was safety, but perhaps companionship can be safer, if chosen wisely. The rancher turned to her, his expression gentle. It is a choice, he said, and I choose it every day with you. A faint smile appeared on her lips, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet hope. The bond they had built, tested by danger, shared labor, and quiet understanding, had grown stronger. They had survived threats, weathered storms, and faced fear together. And in doing so, they discovered that trust, patience, and care could create something as resilient as the land itself. The summer nights grew long, and the days were filled with work and small joys. They laughed together, shared meals, and supported each other in ways that neither had expected. The widow began to see that life did not have to be endured alone. The rancher realized that trust could be earned, and that the challenges of the frontier were easier when faced side by side. And so, in the quiet of the plains, under the vast, endless sky, two people, scarred by loss, shaped by solitude, and tested by the world, began to understand that life could be shared without losing independence, that trust could be given without weakening, and that love could grow even in the harshest conditions. The frontier had more trials to offer, and the past would not remain buried. Yet in this moment they had discovered the power of standing together, of facing danger side by side, and of finding in each other a strength that neither had known alone. And as they settled inside the cabin for the night, the widow resting her head for the first time in months with a faint sense of ease, and the rancher keeping a quiet vigil at her side, they both understood that the most difficult battles were not only those of survival, but also of trust, courage, and the willingness to let someone in, even after years of solitude. The heat of summer began to fade, and the plains took on the soft colors of early autumn. The tall grass swayed in gentle waves under the breeze, and the air smelled of dry earth, wildflowers, and smoke from distant fires. For the rancher and the widow, life had settled into a rhythm that was both challenging and comforting. The events of the past months, the fires, storms, and intruders, had tested their courage, trust, and resilience. Now the land seemed quieter, as if giving them a moment to breathe and reflect on what they had built together. The rancher rose early one morning, as he always did, tending to the cattle and repairing fences. The widow followed, her presence a steady comfort beside him. She no longer needed to test him with challenging tasks, but she still observed him closely, noticing his patience, his strength, and the way he moved with quiet confidence. Together, they worked in harmony, the routine of frontier life binding them in ways words could not fully describe. After the morning chores, the widow suggested they take a walk along the ridge overlooking the plains. The rancher nodded, and together they walked in silence, their steps careful on the uneven ground. The view stretched endlessly before them, a sea of gold and green, dotted with the occasional grove of trees and a distant stream glinting in the sunlight. I never thought life could feel like this, the widow said softly, breaking the silence. After all I have endured, all I have survived, I did not believe I could feel safe or even happy again. The rancher glanced at her, his eyes gentle. Life on the frontier is hard, he said, but it is not impossible. You have survived so much because of your strength, and now you do not have to face it alone. She looked down, considering his words. I have always relied on myself, she admitted. Trusting someone else felt like giving away a part of my strength. But with you, it feels different. I feel lighter, somehow. Not weaker, but freer. The rancher smiled. That is what it means to face life together. You do not lose strength by trusting. You gain support. You gain someone who stands with you, not against you. They continued walking, the wind carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. The rancher felt a quiet warmth in his chest. He had come to the plains as a lonely man, accustomed to solitude and silence. Now beside him was someone who challenged him, cared for him, and had begun to let him into her life. He understood that their connection was rare, forged through trials and patience, and that it had grown into something neither could ignore. As they returned to the cabin, the widow paused by the garden they had cultivated together. The plants were thriving, a testament to their shared effort and care. She knelt, gently touching the soil, and smiled faintly. We have built something here, she said. Not just a garden, but a life. A place where we can survive and maybe even be happy.
The rancher joined her, kneeling beside her. Yes, he said.
We have faced storms, fire, and danger. We have learned to trust and rely on each other. And we have come through stronger. They rose together, the weight of their shared experiences settling around them like a quiet promise. Life on the frontier would never be without challenges, but they now had something that made those challenges bearable: each other. Days passed, and the seasons began to change. The plains turned shades of brown and gold, and the nights grew colder. The rancher and the widow continued to work side by side, tending to the land and preparing for the winter. Their bond deepened with each passing day, strengthened not only by shared labor but also by moments of quiet connection, meals eaten together, conversations under the stars, and the simple comfort of knowing someone was watching over the same land. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, they sat outside the cabin, sharing a meal. The air was cool, carrying the scent of smoke from the fireplace and the faint aroma of wild herbs. The widow looked at the rancher, her expression soft but thoughtful. "I have lived so long with fear and caution," she said. "I thought that was the only way to survive. But now I see that life is more than survival. It is trust, connection, and the courage to care for someone else." The rancher reached for her hand, holding it gently. "It is also about hope," he said. "Hope that the future can be better, that the hardships can be shared, and that we do not have to face them alone." She squeezed his hand lightly, a quiet acknowledgement that their lives were now intertwined. "I never imagined I would find this," she admitted.